Hello and welcome to Read Through the Word. Today is October 26th, and so glad to have you here today. I hope you're having a good fall, depending on which part of the country or even world you're in. I am, as I've mentioned before, in the north. I'm in Wisconsin, so the trees are in full color, and it is also getting colder. So I hope wherever you are that you are enjoying this season, and welcome today. So today I am going to talk about when Jesus when Jesus teaches and reveals to people what he says is the greatest commandment. And I love this verse, Matthew 22:37-40. Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." So, it was actually a common issue at that time historically among ancient rabbis to discuss and question which commandments were heavier, so to speak, or more important, and which commandments were lighter. So this was a common topic of conversation. It's not really odd that they asked him this question. At the same time, because Jesus had been answering both the Pharisees, Sadducees, teachers of the law. He had been answering them in such a way that kind of silenced them or just brought a perspective they couldn't argue with. This is definitely a question where I'm not sure it was with full curiosity, if it was asked with curiosity, or if it was asked with like, what do you think? Because whatever his answer was, they definitely could have been looking for a way to kind of trap him in his answer. So this teacher of the law, this expert of the law, tests Jesus with this question. So it does say he's trying to test him here. And he asks him, which is the greatest commandment? I'm curious. I would be curious to look back into historical writings or whatever it may be to find out how these discussions went among other rabbis. What did other rabbis say the most important commandment was? Because they did talk about it, what they thought was more important versus kind of a lighter commandment. It would be interesting to know. But Jesus, of course, gives this beautiful answer. And according to the IVP Bible Background Commentary, it says, following Jewish interpretive technique, Jesus links the two commandments from Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. We'll talk about this in a second. He links them by a shared key expression in Hebrew, and you shall love. The Hebrew word is ve'ahavta. So, and you shall love. Jewish ethics repeatedly stressed love of God and of others. Deuteronomy 6, we're going to do actually verses 4 and 5 says, "Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength." So this was part of the Shema, which was, a group of verses, prayers recited every morning and every evening. And so this was a key part of the Shema. Shema is the Hebrew word for hear. So Shema Israel would have been, hear, O Israel, listen, O Israel, Shema Israel. And I had to learn to say these verses in Hebrew years ago, and it was really fun to learn. I actually included a link to just a little YouTube video that teaches you to learn to say this part of the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, teaches you to say it in Hebrew from a native Hebrew speaker. It's really fun. And so I added that link there. Let me know if you end up doing it, or but I really enjoyed it. And this particular YouTube video is really well done. It makes it easy to follow. So this was an important part of the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? And the other verse that Jesus links in is from Leviticus 19:18. It says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself." And so really what Jesus is doing here is, again, a brilliant answer, but it's not brilliant just because he's brilliant, which obviously he was and is. It's brilliant because it addresses the whole heart of everything Jesus is trying to get across, especially to these Pharisees and teachers of the law and Sadducees. He's trying to say, look, it is not about checking off a list every day. I did this, I didn't do this. I did this, I didn't do this. He's saying that's not what it's about. That all the law and the prophets hangs on this. Love God, love others. It's interesting too, a quote here from the Archaeological Bible about the kind of the overwhelmingness, if that's a word, of these of the law, of these regulations that were taught to and given to the Jewish people. I'm going to read that quote here. It says, "After the Babylonian exile, the Jewish rabbis began to make meticulous rules and regulations governing the daily life of people." I want to stop there just for a second. Remember, before the exile, it was just massive defilement of the temple, of the law, of the priests, and there was greed and there was corruption, right? And we've talked about how after the exile, when people came back to Jerusalem and began to rebuild the temple, there was almost like this pendulum swinging in the other direction, where it was like, we can never end up like that again. We are going to follow this law. So both extremes are not helpful. All right, let's continue on here. Talking about the rules and regulations governing the daily life of people after the exile. These were interpretations and applications of the law of Moses, handed down from generation to generation. In Jesus' day, this tradition of the elders was an oral form. It was not until about AD 200 that it was put into writing in the Mishnah. Heavy loads, the heavy loads refers to the oral, the heavy loads quote refer to the oral tradition, a distinctive feature of the Pharisees' brand of Judaism. It was intended to make the Old Testament relevant to life situations, but its massive obligations were far more burdensome than Scripture itself. And that's from the Archaeological Study Bible. So, and this is referring to, again, the verse about, giving people these heavy loads to carry. And that's what this is kind of referring to, what Jesus is referring to. The massive obligations were far more burdensome than Scripture itself. And Jesus is saying over and over again, this is not how it's supposed to be. really interesting here. The Hebrew word Torah is often translated as the law. So it was really interesting. I'm taking a Hebrew class here right now, learning ancient Hebrew. And my teacher kind of taught us something interesting. So she said, Torah is a Hebrew word, but she said translating it as law is actually not a great translation. She said there are other Hebrew words that are more closely translated as like law, regulations. Here are all the rules. Torah, she said, is a better translation would be teaching or instructions or guidance. And this was the example she gave. She said, okay, as a parent, she might say to her child, don't run in the street. As a parent, you might say to your child, don't go running in the street. And that is a good rule, right? But is it a rule that should always be followed to the very letter of the law? What if there's a time where you could play in the street? Now, I understand most of the time we would not advocate that, but let's say a street's blocked off and you have a bunch of kids getting together to play a game on it. I don't know. And that child might say, but I can never, ever, ever play in the street. They could even interpret it so far as, like, let's say they're playing with a ball in the driveway, the ball goes in the street. I cannot get that ball. I cannot go play in the street. And so it would become this rigid expectation, like at no time ever, under any circumstances, are you to play in the street. But really, as a parent, that's not what we would try to teach a child or a teacher or whatever. Teacher, parent, grandparent, that's not necessarily what we're trying to teach them. We're teaching them the wisdom, the guidance of what it means to be safe. No, we don't just go run out and play in the street when it's not safe to do so. So what you're trying to build in your child is wisdom to understand there are specific rules to things, but how those rules and instructions, how they play out in everyday life, it's not always black and white. That's how some instructions are. And if you have a kid who's really literal, you already know this, right? If you give them a rule or something and they find 100 loopholes and it's like, okay, never mind. You're not trying to teach them this instruction always works every time. You're trying to give them guidance and wisdom about how this instruction looks in everyday life. And she said that is really more the meaning behind Torah. So you think, for example, about when, Jesus healing on the Sabbath. That was a rule, a regulation that, no work on the Sabbath, no exceptions whatsoever. Here's this rule. Right? And the Pharisees had carried this rule to the letter of the law and to an extreme legalistic point. And Jesus is saying to them, that's not what Torah is about. Torah means we have this underlying foundation that says the most important commandment is love God and love others. And how that instruction looks like in everyday life isn't necessarily going to be, don't do this ever, or like you'll be punished. Because Jesus was saying, yeah, I'm going to heal on the Sabbath. Because the wisdom and the guidance coming from Torah is not telling me to follow a picky rule no matter what. It's giving guidance and instruction that makes that rule applicable to real life under the umbrella of sort of under the canopy or umbrella of this overarching idea that we love God and we love others, and that is the most important commandment. So, Torah was supposed to help people understand and live out how they could live for God, but it wasn't to just, the purpose wasn't to just be this rigid rule followed within such narrow framework that they actually added so much burden to people, right? So many burdens to people that it actually became more burdensome than Scripture itself. And Jesus was trying to address that. So, love the Lord with your whole life. As we're teaching others about Jesus, teaching your children, teaching people in a classroom, teaching others in a church, just talking to your neighbor, talking to family, talking to friends, as we're showing people and teaching people who Jesus is, let's keep that in mind. Torah is love the Lord your God with your whole life and love your neighbor as yourself. Thanks for joining me here today, and we'll see you next time on Read Through the Word.